The whispered legend of a mysterious killer. In the late 1990s, nestled in the quiet suburbs of California, a sinister wave of fear rippled through the community. It started with whispers, soft, chilling ones that snuck into neighborhood gatherings, local diner conversations, and late-night radio shows. People talked in low tones about young women disappearing under mysterious circumstances, each one more puzzling than the last. These weren't your typical cases of someone running away or falling victim to unfortunate accidents. No, there was something far darker lurking beneath the facade of normalcy. The victims all fit an unnervingly specific profile. Vibrant women in their 20s and 30s who loved the outdoors. They'd often be seen jogging solo in quiet parks or hiking isolated trails in the expansive Californian countryside. These were the typical spots one would visit for peace, a connection to nature, or simply a moment of escape from life's grind. But it seemed this quest for serenity had tragically led all too many directly into the clutches of a predator. What turned these disappearances from tragic to terrifying were the bodies, or lack thereof at first. Weeks would pass before someone stumbled across the remains of one of the victims in remote, desolate areas. The scenes were gruesome, a young woman with her life robbed violently, and the unsettling breadcrumbs left behind. The bodies bore clear signs of struggle, of cruelty, and of a meticulously intentional act. Most haunting of all, a miniature Bible rested nearby each victim. It was always the same, a pocket-sized version, perfectly preserved, as if to add a cruel layer of mockery or symbolism to the horror. But the truly spine-chilling aspect of these tragedies wasn't just the bodies or the eerie symbols left behind, it was the whispers about who the killer might be. Witness accounts were rare, inconsistent, and fragmentary, but they all hinted at a pattern. Passers-by reported seeing a strange figure, a young man dressed in religious garb, radiating an aura of calm and trustworthiness. His confident, sermon-like voice lulled strangers into letting their guard down. He didn't appear outwardly dangerous. He wasn't the looming shadow in a dark alley or a vagrant with suspicious eyes. Instead, he was clean-cut, well-dressed, and carried himself with an air of purpose that could only come from a man cloaked in divine authority, or so it seemed. That boy had the look of a preacher, one elderly woman later recalled in a local news interview. He had the kind of voice that could lead you to church or straight over a cliff. This supposed man of God sparked endless speculation and fear. Could a spiritual leader, a figure meant to be a beacon of trust and morality, truly be behind such unspeakable evil? No way, some figured. It had to be a coincidence, some devious trick by a deranged individual dressing as a clergyman to cloak his atrocities. Or maybe, others whispered more conspiratorially, it's something much darker, like a cult or a rogue preacher twisting scripture to justify madness. In an era before social media and widespread true crime podcasts, rumors about the preaching killer spread quickly through word of mouth and sensationalized news reports. For weeks, worried parents banned their daughters from venturing out alone. Searches for suspects ballooned into chaotic wild goose chases. Any man who so much as owned a clerical collar came under suspicion. False leads and dead ends piled up high enough to rival the fear itself, but no one could target the elusive perpetrator. He was like a ghost, slipping in and out of communities, striking without warning, and leaving only sorrow and a Bible behind. For the residents of the area, this killer was more than just a murderer. He represented a betrayal of trust, an affront to that unspoken promise of safety one feels in the presence of a religious figure. And until he was caught, if that day ever came, neighbors would continue to look warily over their shoulders, jump at unexpected noises, and avoid walking alone, even in places they once considered their own personal sanctuaries. The deceptive man of God. At first glance, there was nothing unsettling about him. In fact, if you came across him walking down the quiet streets of a suburban town, you might have gone out of your way to offer him a friendly nod, or a polite hello. He wasn't the shadowy figure hiding in the dark corners of alleyways or the kind of person who made you instinctively clutch your bag tighter. No, he was different. He was polished, composed, seemingly full of divine purpose, a self-proclaimed servant of God. The man was always dressed in clerical garb, a simple black suit with a white collar or, on cooler days, a long coat that framed his thin, almost fragile frame. With his Bible often tucked under one arm, his entire presence exuded both authority and humility. He moved with controlled grace, the kind that demanded trust. His demeanor, soothing in an unnatural way, carried an air of unshakable conviction, the kind of resolve one imagines a holy man living by. But underneath this carefully curated facade lay something rotten, something unholy, an insidious darkness masked by the purity of his appearance. He had a knack for blending seamlessly into communities across the state. Despite his transient nature, he always seemed to know the nuances of each town he entered. People would notice him lingering around small churchyards or arriving early for Sunday sermons. He wasn't attached to a particular congregation, but he would present himself as a traveling minister of sorts, offering his pastoral services to any church that welcomed him. And churches, more often than not, welcomed him with open arms. He carried himself like a man of deep faith, his soft-spoken words laced with what seemed like gospel truths. He knew just how to speak to people, to make them feel seen, understood, and most importantly, safe. "If you're lost, child," he once told a young mother outside of a grocery store, "turn to God. He watches over all of us, especially the weak." There was no denying his magnetism. He could turn a stranger's skepticism into a curious smile faster than most could recite a prayer. He often lingered after sermons, eager to offer counsel to those who needed it, or sometimes even those who didn't. Women, in particular, seemed to catch his attention. He played the role of a caring shepherd perfectly, leaning in with a tender smile, his voice dropping just enough to sound intimate but never inappropriate, at least not outwardly. For many, he seemed like the trustworthy guide everyone wanted in their lives. For others, though, there was something unsettling about him. A handful of people, those who were perhaps a little more perceptive, described feeling an odd discomfort in his presence. They couldn't quite put their finger on it, but there was something about his eyes, something cold, watchful, predatory. It was as though while he spoke of salvation and love, his gaze was dissecting you, peeling back layers to see what made you vulnerable. "He's got this calm, God-fearing exterior," one local man later said in a news interview, "but behind those eyes, something just ain't right. It's like he's measuring you, figuring you out." Occasionally someone would question how a seemingly devout man ended up wandering from town to town without a solid home base. If pressed too hard, though, he would artfully deflect with melancholic tales of being a traveling servant of God, spreading his message wherever it was needed most. These explanations, paired with his eloquence, usually quelled doubts, but not everything about him added up. For starters, his story often shifted in subtle ways. In one town, he claimed to have studied theology in Boston. In another, he was a Midwest native who found his calling after enduring personal tragedy. One small chapel in Fresno remembered him speaking fluent Latin during prayers, yet when asked later to assist with translating a passage from the Bible, he stumbled, offering vague excuses. Then there was his unsettling habit of appearing just before calamity struck. In towns where women went missing, neighbors would later recall seeing him before or around the same time as the disappearances. He was the one offering vague reassurances, consoling terrified communities with promises that evil cannot persist where faith remains strong. And then, as quickly as he entered their lives, he would vanish, often before investigators began piecing together timelines or connecting dots. To some, he was a good man traveling on a righteous path. To others, he was an enigmatic figure cloaked in suspicion, and to a terrified few, the ones lucky enough to escape his grasp, he was a demon cloaked in a preacher's robe. One survivor described him as the perfect storm of charm and menace. "When he spoke," she said, "you wanted to believe him, you wanted to trust him, but when I looked into his eyes, I knew I had to get away." What made him particularly dangerous wasn't just the veneer of his harmlessness, but his ability to exploit the implicit trust that came with his role. In a culture that revered figures of the cloth, he knew that donning the attire of a preacher opened doors, disarmed doubts, and silenced suspicions. It wasn't just his disguise, it was his weapon. He wasn't merely hiding in plain sight as a man of faith. No, he was weaponizing faith. He preyed on its sanctity, using it as a shield while he hunted under the guise of protection. And for years he evaded justice, slipping through the cracks of a system not prepared for a wolf in sheep's clothing. The shocking murders. The first body wasn't discovered right away. In fact, it took weeks filled with growing worry, whispered rumors, and silent prayers, before someone stumbled onto the macabre discovery deep in the woods near a quiet rural church. It was a jogger, a man out for his usual early morning run, who came across the lifeless form of a young woman, her body unnaturally still and surrounded by the eerie stillness of the forest. She'd been killed in an unfathomably brutal way. The medical examiner later revealed the vivid details: signs of strangulation around her neck, bruises indicating a violent struggle, and a fatal blow to the head that ended her young life far too soon. A visitor, a mourner perhaps, might have mistaken the scenario for a chilling piece of performance art. Placed with unsettling precision next to the body was a small, pocket-sized Bible, the kind handed out at mission trips or street corners. It looked pristine, untouched by her blood or the dirt that surrounded her. The placement was deliberate. The Bible was no coincidence. This horrifying detail quickly became a grim signature. The news reports labeled the unknown killer as the preaching killer, a man, or monster some said, who left behind not just a trail of grieving families but also symbolic breadcrumbs that seemed to mock the very notion of faith. And hers wasn't the only death. Over the span of 3 years, other women, young, healthy, vibrant, met similar fates. One victim was found lying beneath a collapsed tree in a rarely visited state park. Another was discovered slumped against the wooden door of an old church that had long since been abandoned. The conditions of their bodies were disturbingly familiar. Each bore the marks of a deeply personal violence, bruises wrapped around their wrists and ankles as if bound by rope. Cuts across their palms suggested desperate attempts to defend themselves. And of course, there was always the Bible. "It almost felt like he wanted us to find them," one detective remarked to the press, shaking his head in disbelief. "It's like he was leaving his own form of twisted testimony." The victim profiles were frighteningly similar as well. All were women, alone at the time of their disappearances, with an apparent love for fitness and nature. They were often seen jogging along empty trails, hiking solitary paths, or enjoying the scenic isolation of rural parks. Amanda, the only survivor to escape his clutches, later speculated that they were targeted because they were alone, but brave. Women who saw no reason to fear the wilderness. "I think it was control," Amanda shared during a televised interview. "He didn't just want to hurt you, he wanted to take over, to strip you of every ounce of power. That's why it was always women who seemed strong." But the most disturbing discovery came with the revelation that some of these crimes might not have been isolated tragedies. Slowly, law enforcement began linking cases across county lines, even state lines, to the same perpetrator. States including Arizona and Nevada began reporting eerily similar murders. Bound victims, consistent signs of restraint, and always the Bible placed as if it were some kind of final judgment. One of the most chilling details was the scene surrounding the third discovered victim. She had gone missing less than a week prior while hiking in the California redwoods, a trip she'd been eagerly documenting on her Instagram account. Police later determined that her killer had likely followed her discreetly, waiting until she was deep enough into the woods that no one could hear her cries. Her body was found hidden in a hollowed-out tree trunk, her face badly bruised but eerily serene, as if arranged for a macabre last viewing. And there it was again, the Bible, this time with a passage from Proverbs underlined in bright red ink. A way that seems right to a man, but in the end, it leads to death. The gruesome murders sent shockwaves across the nation. From televised news reports to national crime magazines, the preaching killer became a morbid fascination. Crime analysts debated whether this bizarre persona was genuine or simply a facade masking not faith but pure savagery. Was this a man convinced he was fulfilling some divine mission, or was the Bible merely a tool wielded by a deranged mind? Some speculated that the killer was part of a fringe Christian group, a rogue preacher who twisted scripture to justify unspeakable brutality. Others doubted this altogether, theorizing he was a calculated predator who saw in religious symbols nothing more than a disturbingly effective psychological weapon to distract, confuse, and terrify. The cases became a cautionary tale that echoed through communities, with parents forbidding their daughters from hiking alone and churches urging their members to walk in groups. Municipal parks once bustling with runners and bikers grew eerily empty, trails fell silent save for the crunch of nervous footsteps. Law enforcement agencies ramped up patrols and partnered across multiple jurisdictions, but the killer eluded them, slipping silently and without trace. Perhaps the most haunting question of all was whether the killer knew these women as people, or merely as targets. Detectives debated if he spent weeks studying them, noting when they were alone and determining when and where to strike. Or worse yet, some investigators whispered, he could have been sitting among them every Sunday morning, bowing his head in false prayer as his next victim sat only a few pews away. "For a guy like this," one local sheriff stated grimly during an interview, "there are no boundaries. The church walls don't keep him out, the forest trails don't slow him down, and the scariest part, some people probably invited him into their lives, never knowing they were opening the door to a monster. By the time Michael Carter, a former pastor turned vagabond and the eventual prime suspect, was finally apprehended, the full weight of his crimes had rocked the community to its moral core. His arrest offered relief, yes, but also an uneasy reflection. How could evil wear the face of righteousness for so long? How far can someone take the illusion of faith before it becomes a weapon unto itself? For the victims' families, no amount of justice could fill the hollow void left behind. For the towns he haunted, his name became a cautionary tale whispered in darkened rooms, a reminder that sometimes the devil doesn't come cloaked in darkness, but in light. The clear victim profile. If there was one thing that struck investigators and the public alike about the preaching killer's spree, it was his methodical approach to selecting his victims. He didn't choose haphazardly. These weren't crimes of opportunity or random attacks born from spur-of-the-moment impulses. No, his victims seemed to be handpicked with precision and a dark purpose. All the women had traits that surfaced again and again in case files. They were young, usually between their mid-20s to early 30s, with bright and promising lives ahead of them. They exuded vibrancy, strength, and independence, whether through their professions, their hobbies, or simply the way they carried themselves. Many were described by friends and family as resilient individuals, often the kind of people others turn to for support and inspiration. In a weird way, one victim's best friend stated during a heartbreakingly candid interview, Katie was unstoppable. She loved her freedom, especially being outdoors where she felt alive. She wasn't afraid of anything. She definitely wouldn't have backed down from a creep. In fact, that shared love of the outdoors seemed to be one of the very lures that drew them into the killer's web. Each woman was last seen alone, exploring quiet hiking trails, jogging their favorite running routes, or finding solace in nature's embrace, spaces they felt were their sanctuaries. It was here, amidst the serenity of the wild, that they encountered something sinister, something that turned their tranquil escapes into nightmarish endings. The locations he chose to stalk his prey were always remote yet not entirely deserted, a perfect blend of seclusion and accessibility. These environments provided him with the cover he needed to observe and analyze without drawing unwanted attention. He studied his prospective victims' habits and routines, spending days, even weeks, silently lurking in the background until the moment was ripe for action. What seemed particularly twisted about his methodology was his uncanny ability to spot vulnerability, even in the strongest of women. Detectives later pieced together how small moments, a solo detour down an unmarked trail, a slight hesitation at a fork in the path, or an innocent stop to tie a shoelace, seemed to trigger his assaults. His prey might have appeared bold and independent, but to him, it was merely a game of finding their one exposed flank. He didn't pick women who seemed weak, a profiler noted during a press conference. He picked women who seemed confident, self-assured, the kind of women who didn't think they needed to look over their shoulder. Rebecca Collins, for instance, was a renowned environmental advocate, a 31-year-old who spent years hiking California's preserves, mapping uncharted trails and documenting rare plant life. She'd grown up surrounded by nature, and was the kind of person who knew the wilderness better than most. When her body was discovered in a clearing deep within Sequoia National Park, friends and colleagues were stunned. "It didn't make sense," said one fellow hiker. "She knew better than anyone how to read danger signs, how to stay safe. I still can't believe it happened to her." But for the monster masquerading as a man of God, it wasn't just their isolation that made them ideal targets. It was the trust they placed in him when he emerged from hidden brush, or stepped out onto the path ahead of them, to a woman walking alone through scenic solitude. The sight of a preacher, clad in clerical garb, Bible either tucked under one arm or loosely gripped in his hand, wasn't threatening. Far from it. It may have even been reassuring. After all, who would ever suspect ill intent from a man of faith? These women seemed to share an unspoken connection to their surroundings, a pull toward serenity and peace that rural California provided in abundance, and yet the very traits they cherished, independence and a love of nature, became the vulnerabilities exploited by the killer. Take Lisa Monroe, for example. A 28-year-old marketing executive from Los Angeles, Lisa was described by her peers as a workaholic who found her balance and peace during weekend getaways to hike California's rugged coastline. One October, she decided to set off on a solo hike after finishing a major project at work. "I remember her being so excited to unwind," her roommate later recalled. "She loved the woods. She said the quiet cleared her mind. She wasn't afraid of being alone in nature at all. It was her therapy." By the time her body was found days later, deep in a state park she had visited many times, the pattern was undeniable. Like others, Lisa was discovered with bruises signaling a violent struggle. And there it was again, a copy of the Bible placed just inches from where her head had rested, open to a verse about submission. Each case reinforced the killer's MO, strong, independent women lured by their desire to escape their day-to-day lives, only to unknowingly walk into his tangled web. And the irony wasn't lost on investigators. A man who preyed on those seeking peace and solitude had turned these same environments into haunted landscapes, stripped of their innocence. In another world, a behavioral analyst explained during a true crime documentary years later, these women could have been anyone's sister, wife, or daughter. They were doing the things they loved, their guards lowered because nature felt safe. That emotional vulnerability may have been the scariest thing he exploited. The clarity of the victim profile only added to the community's unease. Outdoor recreation, the simple indulgence of a hike or run, became a calculated risk. Friends and families urged women to walk in groups, yet the killer continued to elude justice for years. It was the cruelest kind of manipulation, to see strength in others and twist it into an opening for violence. And so, fear lingered not just in the parks and trails of California, but in the hearts of every woman who dared to venture into the embrace of the wilderness alone. Would she be next? Would he be hiding in plain sight, dressed as a shepherd of faith, watching and waiting for his next move? The victims, after all, had once felt safe too. Revelation from a survivor. Not everyone fell prey to the preaching killer. One woman escaped, against all odds and at great personal cost. Her name was Amanda Lowell, and her story became the pivotal break law enforcement desperately needed to finally put a face and a name to the monster haunting their community. It was a crisp autumn morning in 1997 when Amanda, a 27-year-old yoga instructor and avid runner, decided to head out for her usual jog. Her favorite route took her past a stretch of quiet, winding paths that wrapped around the back of the countryside. She'd done this run 100 times before, never once had she felt unsafe. But this time was different. This time she would remember every step, every breath, and every terrifying detail for the rest of her life. "I didn't see him right away," Amanda told reporters years later, her voice steady but overshadowed by a lingering weariness. "I was running my usual trail, past the old, abandoned church on Rivermill Road, when he came out of nowhere. He just appeared, walking towards me, calm as could be. At first I didn't think anything of it. He was dressed like a pastor, you know, black suit, white collar, even had a little Bible in his hand. I actually slowed down a little because I thought maybe he needed something." Amanda recalled the way the man smiled at her, a warm, comforting gesture that masked the cold intent lurking just beneath the surface. He said something like, "Good morning, sister. It's a blessing to see one of God's creations so full of life." I thought it was a little strange, sure, but not threatening. Honestly, I thought he was just one of those wandering preachers you run into sometimes, maybe a little eccentric, but harmless. And then, everything changed. Her voice faltered slightly as she described the moment when her gut instinct told her something was off. As she attempted to jog past him, the man turned suddenly, dropping his comforting facade. Amanda remembered the sudden shift in his demeanor, how his tone became commanding, almost predatory. Before she had time to react, he grabbed her wrist with a firm, unyielding grip. "I froze," she admitted. "It's weird. You always think you're going to fight back in situations like that. You picture yourself kicking and punching, but when it happens, when it's real, your body just locks up." The man held her arm tightly, his calm smile now replaced with an expression she described as cold and calculating. He began talking to her in a low voice, almost a whisper. "You shouldn't be out here alone," he said. "Women like you, running away from the safety of God. But don't worry, that's why I'm here, to bring you back to him." What happened next could only be described as sheer desperation and survival instinct kicking in. As the man reached into his pocket, Amanda spotted a glint of metal, later revealed to be a blade. Her paralysis broke. Without thinking, she swung the only weapon she had on her aluminum water bottle. I hit him as hard as I could," she said, her hands trembling at the memory. "I didn't think it would do much, but it surprised him enough that he let go for a split second. That was all I needed." Amanda took off running, her heart pounding louder than her feet on the dirt path. She didn't look back. "I don't know if he chased me," she said. "I didn't care. I just kept running until I saw a car on the road, and I flagged it down. I was screaming so loud the driver thought I'd been in an accident." Though Amanda escaped with her life, the trauma of the encounter lingered. She struggled to sleep for months, haunted by visions of the man's eyes, cold, calculating, predatory. They weren't the eyes of a preacher, she confessed, they were the eyes of something darker, something inhuman. Her account gave law enforcement one of their most critical insights into the preaching killer. She described him as being in his late 30s or early 40s, with slicked-back dark hair and a thin, wiry frame. His demeanor, she said, was his most disarming weapon. He made you trust him. Even when you felt something was wrong, his voice, his presence made you want to doubt your instincts. That's what makes him dangerous. He doesn't scare you right away. He lulls you into a false sense of security. It was thanks to Amanda's brave testimony that investigators began connecting the dots. For months they had been chasing fragmented clues, vague sightings of a traveling preacher, reports of a man fitting his description near crime scenes, and the unsettling consistency of the Bible left at each location. But until Amanda's encounter, they didn't have anyone who had seen the man and lived to tell the story. Her willingness to speak up also sparked controversy within the local community. Some residents were uncomfortable with the idea of painting a religious figure, even a fraudulent one, as a murderer. Others rallied around her, calling her one of the bravest women to step forward in the case. Years later, Amanda admitted she still felt the weight of survivors' guilt. "I think about the other women," she said, her voice heavy with emotion. "The ones who didn't get away. Why me? Why did I get a second chance? I'll never stop asking that question." Despite her survival, Amanda's life would never quite be the same. She moved away from California shortly after the attack, unable to bear the memories tied to the case. But her warning served as a crucial guide for authorities and a sobering reminder to women everywhere. Not all monsters hide in the shadows. Some of them walk in plain sight, dressed in the garb of trust and piety, waiting for a moment to strike. Amanda's escape and testimony not only breathed new life into the investigation but also galvanized the public to stay wary, even in places they once considered safe. Her story of survival became a symbol of hope, but also a grim reminder of the danger lurking where you least expect it. The police investigation, from dead end to breakthrough ***. The investigation into the preaching killer started as a frustrating puzzle, with far too many missing pieces. By the time local law enforcement realized they were chasing a serial offender, they were already at a severe disadvantage. Each case seemed to spring up in a different jurisdiction, often in neighboring counties or even states. The lack of direct connections between the crime scenes initially caused investigators to treat each case as isolated. Tragic, yes, but not part of a larger, sinister pattern. "We didn't even know we were looking for the same guy," Sergeant Bill Porter, one of the lead investigators, later admitted during an interview. "At first it felt like we were chasing shadows. He would strike, leave almost no physical evidence, and then just disappear." The challenges were overwhelming. The locations of the crimes were remote and diverse: state parks, forest trails, rural churches, making it nearly impossible to establish a consistent locality. Victims' belongings, such as phones, wallets, or even fitness trackers, were either destroyed or missing, leaving little for forensic experts to analyze. DNA evidence was scarce, and there were no witnesses who had ever seen the killer in action, until Amanda's miraculous escape. Her account was the first tangible thread the police could cling to. She provided them with a description of the man, his wiry frame, his predatory eyes, and most crucially, his clerical attire. For the first time, investigators had a potential profile, someone posing as a man of God to disarm and charm his victims before striking. Amanda's testimony also opened the door to more significant theorizing. Was this man truly a rogue religious figure, or was he using faith as a facade to mask his darker intentions? The turning point came when detectives began to dig deeper into reports of wandering preachers and traveling ministers whose introductions to local communities coincided with the murders. Small-town churches often welcomed outside clergy with little to no vetting of their backgrounds, a vulnerability the killer had clearly exploited. Investigators started combing through church rosters, guest lists, and even donation logs, hunting for someone who didn't quite belong. But even with Amanda's account and this growing knowledge of his MO, modus operandi, the killer was elusive. He didn't linger in one place long enough for anyone to grow suspicious. He rarely left traces, and those he did leave, like the mini Bibles, were intentionally staged, more symbolic than practical for forensic analysis. The absence of hard evidence created an atmosphere of paranoia. There were reports of strangers matching his description all over California and neighboring states, causing patrol officers to chase down countless false leads. Churches began implementing stricter visitor policies, but the damage was already done. The killer had weaponized the trust inherent in religious spaces, turning them into hunting grounds. He preyed on people's faith, Detective Linda Ramirez explained in a crime documentary years later, and in the process, he preyed on the trust that entire communities had in their sanctuaries. That's what made stopping him so incredibly difficult. You weren't just pursuing a criminal, you were pursuing someone hiding behind the facade of divinity. One of the primary breakthroughs came not from a single case, but through linking multiple cases that had previously been overlooked. Investigators began comparing notes across counties and state offices, pooling together every shred of data tied to murders involving women in isolated locations and the presence of the preacher-like figure. Piecing together geographic patterns gave the investigation its next big lead. The killer was incredibly mobile, traveling widely and unpredictably, yet always targeting places where trust and routine created the perfect blind spots. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit, BAU, was eventually brought into the case to help construct a psychological profile. They theorized that the killer wasn't just someone using religion as a mask for convenience. He likely saw himself as a figure of authority, perhaps even as someone on a self-righteous mission. The Bibles left at the crime scenes weren't random props. They were messages meant to convey some twisted sense of purpose. Whoever he was, he needed control, said one FBI profiler. Leaving the Bibles was his way of delivering his own kind of warped sermon. To him, these murders weren't just acts of violence, they were statements. Statements he hoped would speak louder than his victims' screams for help. The most painstaking task for investigators became setting up a timeline of the killer's movements. After combing through massive amounts of data, including toll booth footage, gas station receipts, and even church bulletins, detectives discovered a pattern. The killer seemed to attend community events tied to religious gatherings, a church picnic in one town, a charity sermon in another, before disappearing shortly after each crime. In the summer of 1998, the investigation reached its most critical point. Detectives uncovered records of a man claiming ties to various Protestant denominations who had recently been dismissed from a church in San Diego for allegations of inappropriate conduct. His name was Michael Carter, and he fit the profile Amanda had given almost perfectly. Thin, clean-cut, with dark, slicked-back hair and a disarming smile, Carter had spent years bouncing between small churches across the region, leaving behind vague accusations of misconduct wherever he went. None of those allegations, however, had tied him to murder. Finally, authorities believed they had their man, but arresting him would prove to be far trickier than identifying him. Carter had no fixed address, moving frequently to avoid detection, and he was cunning enough to avoid leaving behind any trail that could put him directly at a crime scene. Additionally, there was still no physical evidence definitively linking him to the murders, which meant law enforcement had to be meticulous in their approach to avoid tipping him off or letting him slip away. The break came when detectives decided to set a trap. Collaborating with local churches in a remote Californian town, they arranged for a community sermon that would be open to wandering ministers and traveling clergy. A young undercover officer posed as a woman of faith, walking solo, but carefully monitored, along the wooded paths surrounding the church grounds. The operation nearly fell apart when Carter, true to his cautious nature, lingered for hours without approaching her. But when he finally made his move, offering his signature mixture of charm and scripture, officers moved in swiftly. Michael Carter was apprehended without incident, though the chilling smile he offered the arresting officers was one they wouldn't soon forget. For weeks after his capture, investigators worked tirelessly to piece together direct evidence connecting him to the murders. DNA found on one victim's clothing solidified their case, and further digging revealed a collection of miniature pocket Bibles, identical to the ones left at the crime scenes, stored in the trunk of his car. Looking back, many officers involved in the case admitted that solving it wasn't just about catching a killer. It was about reclaiming a sense of safety and trust that the preaching killer had stolen from an entire region. Detective Ramirez summed it up best. He didn't just break the law. He broke people's faith in each other, in their communities, in their own instincts. That's what made his capture so important. It wasn't just justice. It was a promise that we'd fight this evil no matter how long it took. From dead ends to Michael Carter's capture, the investigation was a testament to persistence, cooperation, and the bravery of survivors like Amanda, whose courage turned the tide in a case that seemed bound for endless darkness. Who was the real killer? By the time investigators uncovered his name and pieced together his story, the shadowy figure known as the preaching killer finally had a face. Michael Carter. To the outside world, Carter might have seemed unremarkable, a transient preacher moving from town to town carrying himself with an air of humility and reverence. He was, as some townsfolk remembered, polite, soft-spoken, even charming in his quiet way. But beneath this carefully maintained persona lurked a darkness that neither his victims nor many of those who had encountered him could have imagined. Michael Carter was born in 1961 in a small town in Arkansas, the youngest of 3 children in a religious but deeply dysfunctional family. His father, a strict and often abusive deacon in a local church, ruled the household with an iron hand. His mother, devout but emotionally detached, spent her days reciting scripture and insisting that the family's struggles were tests from God. For young Michael, religion wasn't just a belief system, it was a weapon, a tool his father used to control him, a lens through which he viewed punishment and power, and eventually, a mask he would use to hide his crimes. He was always the quiet one, a childhood neighbor recalled, years later, kept to himself, stayed out of trouble, but there was something off about him, like you could never quite tell what he was thinking. As a teenager, Carter showed an early interest in theology, but not necessarily out of faith. He was accused of stealing money from the church's donation box on more than one occasion, incidents brushed under the rug by his family and the congregation. Despite his rocky adolescence, Carter somehow managed to enroll in a small Bible college in Texas. For a time, it seemed as if he might genuinely find his calling as a man of God. But those who knew him there described a young man who was more interested in the authority granted by the clergy than in providing spiritual guidance. Records show Carter didn't graduate. He left abruptly after being accused of inappropriate behavior with another student, though no formal charges were ever filed. This would become a recurring pattern in his life, allegations of misconduct followed by sudden departures, with whispers of impropriety left trailing in his wake. By the early 1980s, Michael Carter had begun bouncing between small churches across the country, presenting himself as a devout and humble preacher willing to serve wherever he was needed. At first glance, he appeared like the perfect candidate for struggling congregations desperate to fill their pulpits. He spoke with conviction, often weaving his own fabricated life story into his sermons, claiming to have overcome great personal tragedy through faith. In one town, he told churchgoers he had lost his wife and young daughter in a car accident, a poignant lie that tugged at the heartstrings of those who met him. In another, he portrayed himself as a reformed sinner who had turned away from a life of crime to walk the path of righteousness. It was like he knew exactly what people wanted to hear, one former parishioner said. He wasn't just preaching the gospel, he was selling it, and we bought it, hook, line, and sinker. But Carter's charisma and theological knowledge were merely tools in his arsenal. Over time, cracks in his facade became evident. Strangely erratic behavior, inappropriate comments toward women, and frequent disputes with fellow clergy members. These incidents often resulted in him being asked to leave, though few churches ever reported or lawfully pursued his misconduct. Instead, they let him move on, unwittingly enabling him to establish new identities and continue his path of deception. In 1992, Carter resurfaced in Southern California, taking on the guise of a traveling preacher. It was during this period that he truly perfected his disarming act. Dressed in modest clerical garb, with a Bible always close at hand, he presented himself as someone the community could trust. But what the congregations didn't know was that Carter had a criminal record. He had served brief jail time in the late 1980s for theft and fraud, charges unrelated to his later killing spree but indicative of his manipulative tendencies. By the mid-1990s, Carter had transitioned from mere deception to violence. Investigators later speculated that the shift in his behavior, the escalation to killing, was likely driven by a combination of his personal frustrations, his growing sense of powerlessness, and his deep-seated resentment toward women. Women who, in his twisted mind, were symbols of independence and defiance against the authority he believed he embodied as a man of God. He saw himself as more than just a preacher, one FBI profiler explained. He saw himself as a judge, a deliverer of his own form of justice. To him, his victims weren't people. They were symbols, representations of something he felt entitled to punish. Carter's victims were carefully chosen. They were young, vibrant, and strong, women who often mirrored the independence and resilience he despised. And yet, they were also trusting, unsuspecting of the threat posed by a man dressed in religious attire. He exploited the sanctity of faith, using it as both his cover and his weapon. The hallmark of his crimes, the small pocket-sized Bible left neatly beside each victim, served as both a taunt and a chilling signature. Investigators theorized that these Bibles reflected Carter's deep need to control the narrative, to impose his own warped sense of morality on his victims, even in death. But the act was more than symbolic. It was theatrical, designed to confuse law enforcement and send a message to those who found the bodies. In the years following his capture, Carter's psychological profile revealed a deeply narcissistic individual with a disturbingly high level of emotional intelligence. He wasn't insane, one psychiatrist who evaluated him noted. He knew exactly what he was doing, he planned it meticulously, and he enjoyed the thrill of being in control. The image of Michael Carter portrayed in court was a far cry from the humble preacher he had pretended to be. Gone was the polished suit and kind smile, replaced instead by an unapologetic smirk and an unshakable arrogance. He refused to show remorse for his crimes, often claiming that his actions were misunderstood. In one chilling statement he told the court, "They were lost, I was just showing them the truth, the cost of straying from God's will." The revelation of Michael Carter's true identity was a gut-wrenching blow for the communities he had terrorized. To think that a man who had stood in their churches, who had prayed with their families and offered words of comfort, could also be the monster who had shattered so many lives, was a betrayal that cut to the core. As for Carter himself, he seemed to revel in the attention his trial brought him, often smirking or shaking his head dismissively at witnesses' testimonies. He appeared indifferent to the pain he had caused, as if his crimes were merely chapters in a story where he was the main character. Ultimately, Michael Carter was sentenced to death for his crimes, but for many, his punishment wasn't enough to erase the fear and distrust he had sown. To this day, those who remember him often describe the unease he left behind, the knowledge that evil can sometimes wear the face of righteousness, and that predators can hide behind the very institutions meant to protect and comfort us. In the end, the question persisted. Was Carter always a monster, or did his mask of faith twist over time into something more sinister? For his victims and their families, the answer hardly mattered. What remained was the devastation he left behind and the chilling realization that for years, the real killer had been hiding in plain sight. The true nature of the evil preacher. To many, Michael Carter seemed like a man of quiet conviction and unwavering faith. Clad in a simple black suit with a white clerical collar, he moved from town to town, his Bible always tucked under one arm like a badge of honor. He presented himself as a devoted guide for lost souls, a preacher without a congregation, traveling wherever he was needed to spread God's word. He was humble, soft-spoken, and eloquent, qualities that disarmed even the most skeptical. Communities opened their churches and, more tragically, their hearts to him, never suspecting the darkness lurking beneath the surface. But behind the polished image of divinity was a predator who had spent years perfecting his craft. Michael Carter wasn't just masquerading as a preacher, he had weaponized the role. Faith, which so many found solace in, became his ultimate tool of manipulation, and he wielded it with an almost surgical precision to target, control, and destroy his victims. A deceptive mask of faith. Carter's life had been one of contradiction from the beginning. Born into a deeply religious yet abusive household, he learned early on how to manipulate faith to serve his needs. His father, a tyrannical deacon, often justified his violence with scripture, twisting verses to instill fear and submission in his children. Young Michael absorbed these lessons not as truths but as tactics, tools for domination and control. He saw the power his father wielded through faith and began replicating it in his own twisted way. Religion for Carter wasn't a sanctuary or a calling. It was a mask, and he wore it meticulously. By his late 20s he had already earned a reputation among small congregations as a charismatic, albeit enigmatic, traveling preacher. He knew how to blend in seamlessly, adopting the customs and language of every community he entered. His sermons, though unremarkable in substance, were hypnotic in delivery. He spoke with passion, weaving carefully rehearsed stories of personal redemption and divine purpose that left his audiences awed and inspired. Yet, while townsfolk saw a devoted man of God, Carter saw something very different: opportunities. Every church that welcomed him, every person who trusted him, was a potential pawn in his game. He didn't see faith as a path to salvation. He saw it as a shortcut to accessing people's deepest insecurities, their vulnerabilities, and ultimately, their lives. A specialist in exploiting trust. What set Carter apart wasn't just his manipulative nature but his uncanny ability to conceal it. To the untrained eye, there was nothing suspicious about him. But Carter's charm wasn't genuine. It was calculated. He had an innate gift for reading people, for sensing their doubts, fears, and motivations. Some survivors who crossed paths with Carter described him as having an almost hypnotic effect. When he looked at you, one woman recalled, it was like he wasn't just listening, he was studying you, peeling back everything you tried to keep hidden. For Carter, trust was the key to accessing his victims, and the guise of a preacher made attaining it remarkably easy. In a society that reveres religious figures as symbols of morality and safety, Carter leveraged their blind faith against them. Who would ever suspect a man of God? His clothing alone was enough to lower defenses. The white clerical collar made him seem not only non-threatening but welcoming. The Bible he carried, always pristine, well-thumbed and marked with colorful tabs, was more than a prop, it was his weapon. It symbolized everything people believed they should respect, and he used it to shield himself from suspicion. But what lay beneath that disguise was chilling. Carter didn't simply manipulate faith to blend in, he actively twisted it to control his victims. He would cite scripture during his encounters, using passages to justify his actions, to confuse, even to paralyze his targets with doubt. "He told me God had sent him," said Amanda Lowell, one of the few women to escape his clutches. "He said I'd been chosen, that God had a plan for me. The way he spoke, it wasn't like he was trying to convince me, it was like he believed it himself." Control, as a driving force psychologist who later studied Carter's behavior, described him as a textbook narcissist with a frighteningly high level of emotional intelligence. He craved control, not just over situations but over people. It wasn't enough for him to kill, he had to dominate his victims first. His methods reflected this. He didn't pursue women randomly, nor did he strike impulsively. Carter watched. He observed their routines, noted their patterns, and waited patiently for the perfect moment to approach. His victims were never weak, they were strong, independent, and confident, and that's exactly why he targeted them. It wasn't about opportunity, one profiler explained during his trial. It was about power. He wanted to break women who thought they couldn't be broken. This pathological need for control extended beyond his crimes. Even in captivity, Carter dominated the narrative. He refused to show remorse in court, smirking through witness testimonies and calling them misguided. At one point, he even interrupted proceedings to claim he was being persecuted, likening himself to biblical figures who had suffered for righteousness. It was a shocking display, one that further highlighted the depth of his delusion and his need to remain the center of attention. A twisted legacy. The hallmark of his killings, the small, pocket-sized Bible left beside each victim, was perhaps the most disturbing insight into Carter's psyche. To law enforcement, it was a signature, a declaration of his involvement. But to Carter, it was more than that. The Bible symbolized his control, his dominance, and in his twisted mind, his message. The passages he underlined in blood-red ink were ominous, often referencing punishment, sin, or submission. Investigators believed these marked Bibles were more than just taunts to law enforcement. They were tools meant to dehumanize his victims, reducing them to pawns in his warped ideological game. In the years following his capture, experts continued to debate whether Carter was truly driven by a distorted sense of religious zeal, or if he had simply chosen faith as the most effective mask for his predatory behavior. Perhaps it was both. After all, Carter's actions weren't disconnected from his religious upbringing. The abuse he endured, the twisted lessons he learned at his father's hand, undoubtedly shaped his worldview. But rather than breaking free from his past, Carter embraced it, weaponizing the very faith that had once oppressed him. Evil in plain sight. What Michael Carter represented wasn't just the failure of a man, he was the failure of a system. Small churches let him drift from one congregation to another, ignoring red flags, failing to report his troubling behavior. Communities gave him the benefit of the doubt because of his clerical collar, never questioning the stranger who spoke so eloquently of God's love, yet left a trail of destruction behind him. For nearly a decade, Carter terrorized countless lives while hiding in plain sight. His true nature wasn't just monstrous, it was camouflaged by the very institution he exploited. By the time the world saw him for what he really was, it was already too late for most of his victims. Michael Carter wasn't a preacher, he wasn't a man of faith. He was a predator with a Bible, using piety as his shield and faith as his sword. In the end, the most chilling aspect of his story wasn't just the violence he inflicted, it was how seamlessly he hid among us, proving that evil doesn't always come dressed as a monster. Sometimes it wears a clerical collar and a smile, waiting patiently for trust to crack the door open. The dramatic arrest. For years, Michael Carter had evaded the long arm of the law. He was cautious, calculated, and impossibly elusive, a phantom who seemed to appear and vanish without a trace. Law enforcement had begun to wonder if catching him was even possible. But that all changed one cold winter day in 1998, when the preaching killer's reign of terror finally came to an end, in a dramatic and nerve-wracking operation that nearly fell apart before it began. By this point, Michael Carter had become a ghost, haunting both law enforcement and the public consciousness alike. His ability to drift undetected between communities, using his polished charisma and religious persona, made him a uniquely dangerous predator. But after years of work and Amanda Lowell's critical testimony, detectives had finally pieced together enough to predict his movements. They understood Carter's pattern. He targeted small, trusting towns near religious hubs, often inserting himself into their church communities before striking. Armed with this knowledge, a team of detectives plotted their one chance to lure him out of the shadows, to bait the very figure who had spent his life using faith and trust as a weapon. It was a risk-filled operation that required precision, patience, and nerves of steel. The trap is set. The plan began with a gathering at a small countryside church just north of Fresno, California. The church, an unassuming wooden building surrounded by rolling hills and a dense grove of trees, seemed like nothing more than a peaceful place of worship. But on this particular day, it was crawling with undercover officers and detectives carefully disguised as parishioners. The ruse leaned heavily on Carter's typical behavioral pattern. He was drawn to religious gatherings, particularly those that seemed welcoming and unguarded. The detectives organized a community sermon and open house, widely advertising it as an event that attracted traveling pastors, guest speakers, and those looking to celebrate their faith. It was meant to look easy to infiltrate, just the kind of opportunity Carter wouldn't pass up. At the heart of the operation was an undercover officer, Claire Matthews, a young and athletic policewoman who volunteered to act as the bait. Dressed casually in a modest sweater and jeans, her assignment was dangerous yet simple: portray a solo, faithful young woman walking the trails just beyond the church's grounds. She carried an aluminum water bottle, wore a basic fitness watch, and stayed within a perimeter monitored by officers stationed at inconspicuous posts nearby. We wanted to mimic his exact type of victim, Sergeant Bill Porter, who led the operation, explained later. Someone out for a moment of peace, someone confident, someone who wouldn't seem guarded, but who matched his pattern perfectly. The clock ticked by agonizingly slowly that day. More than a dozen undercover and uniformed officers scattered around the church, and trails waited in tense silence, scanning for any sign of Carter. The hours felt endless, the biting chill in the air adding to the tension that hung over the operation. Officers questioned whether the plan would work, whether they'd calculated his habits correctly, whether they were truly ready if the situation escalated. The lurking predator. Finally, just after 3 p.m., they spotted him. A man fitting Michael Carter's description walked up the dirt road leading to the church, his familiar black clerical suit crisp against the fading daylight. He carried the same pocket-sized Bible under his arm, his stride calm and purposeful. To anyone else he might have looked like a spiritual visitor seeking fellowship, but to the officers watching from the trees, he was unmistakably their target. He just had this way about him, Detective Ramirez later recalled. Even if you were looking at him from a distance, you could feel it. That man wasn't coming to pray. He was hunting. Carter lingered around the outskirts of the modest gathering, carefully scanning the faces of those seated inside the small church hall. He didn't rush. He was deliberate, taking his time as he appeared to observe and acclimate himself to the surroundings. Officers monitoring him noted how he interacted briefly with others, his smooth, calm demeanor betraying none of the malice they knew lurked beneath. Then his attention shifted. From her post on one of the winding trails behind the church, Claire Matthews deliberately kept her pace slow and steady, walking the path as though she didn't have a care in the world. She wasn't far enough from the church to seem completely isolated, but she wasn't close enough to draw immediate attention, just perfectly in the sweet spot that someone like Carter might see as an opportunity. What happened next felt like something out of a dramatic thriller. Carter began following her, staying several paces behind while trying to mask his movements. Each step he took was a red flag to the officers watching from hidden positions. The man was sizing her up, his head tilting slightly as if deciding whether or not to strike. Her calmness was incredible, Sergeant Porter later said. She knew he was closing in on her, but she didn't panic. She kept walking like she didn't have a clue, just like we'd rehearsed. The moment of confrontation. It wasn't long before Carter made his move. His footsteps quickened, crunching against the fallen leaves of the trail as he finally closed the gap between them. Claire tensed, but didn't turn around. When his voice broke the silence, it was smooth and friendly, the same tone he'd undoubtedly used to approach his previous victims. "Excuse me, miss," he started, holding up the Bible he carried. "Do you have a moment to talk? I wanted to ask you something about faith." In a chilling instant, Carter reached for her arm, but this time, his prey wasn't helpless. Claire twisted away at the last moment, skillfully slipping out of his grasp and sending a prearranged signal to her team by activating her hidden mic. In seconds, the tranquil woods exploded into action. Officers in tactical gear emerged from all around, their footsteps pounding against the ground as they closed in with weapons raised. Carter froze, his predatory calm replaced by shock for the first time. He raised his hands in surrender but didn't look scared. Instead, he simply smirked at the approaching officers. "He didn't fight. He didn't run. He just smiled," Detective Ramirez recounted. "It was like he'd known this day was coming all along and didn't care." Justice finally delivered. Michael Carter was taken into custody without incident, though the arresting officers later admitted they could feel the weight of the moment. This man, who had terrorized countless women and eluded justice for years, was finally in handcuffs. Yet even as they loaded him into the car, Carter's attitude remained unnervingly confident, as if he still believed he held control over the situation. It wasn't until weeks later that additional evidence, including DNA samples, finally and definitively tied him to the crimes. In his car, officers found a duffel bag containing several pocket-sized Bibles, identical to the ones left at his crime scenes, along with a collection of ropes, knives, and other tools investigators believed he used during his attacks. The dramatic arrest of Michael Carter marked the beginning of the end of his horrifying spree. For the officers who had spent years chasing him, it was a moment of profound relief, and a declaration to the communities he had terrorized that justice finally had its hands on the man behind the mask. As Claire Matthews later reflected, he thought he was untouchable. He thought no one would ever stop him. But predators like him always slip up eventually. He didn't count on us fighting back. The sickening confession. When Michael Carter was finally cornered by the damning evidence stacked against him, the facade of the righteous preacher he had so carefully crafted began to crack. For years he had lived as a man cloaked in divine authority, a figure who moved through the world with unsettling confidence and an unnerving calm. But sitting in the pale, fluorescent-lit interrogation room at a California police station, with the weight of his crimes bearing down on him, Michael Carter would finally reveal the monstrous truth lurking beneath the collar. For weeks after his arrest, Carter maintained a mask of indifference. He refused to engage during questioning, offering cryptic smiles and empty platitudes about being misunderstood. "You don't see the whole picture," he said to officers during early interviews. "You think you've caught me, but you're wrong. You're blind to the grand design." Detectives quickly realized they weren't dealing with a man consumed by guilt or remorse. This wasn't someone who would break under traditional interrogation methods. If anything, Carter seemed to enjoy the opportunity to toy with his captors, reveling in the attention as if it was another stage for his performance. The turning point. The breakthrough came 2 weeks later, after detectives presented him with irrefutable evidence. DNA collected from clothing of one of his victims and recovered fibers from his car trunk. It was undeniable. The evidence placed him at the scene of at least one murder, wounding his aura of invincibility. For the first time, Carter's smirk faltered. "You think this proves something?" he asked, leaning back in his chair, his composure slipping ever so slightly. Detective Linda Ramirez, one of the lead investigators, seized the opportunity. She leaned forward, locking eyes with him. "It proves what we already know," Ramirez said firmly. "You're not some misunderstood martyr. You're a coward, and a killer." For hours they pushed, chipping away at Carter's defensive veneer. His demeanor fluctuated between smug dismissiveness and icy silence, but he gradually began to unravel. It wasn't guilt or regret that finally loosened his tongue. It was vanity. Detectives shifted their strategy, framing his crimes as acts so calculated and deliberate that they required a genius-level mind. They played on his narcissism, offering him the stage he so clearly craved. "Tell us how you did it," one detective prompted. "No one else could have done it like you. No one else could have gotten away with it for this long." The room fell silent as Carter leaned forward, his eyes glinting with a mix of pride and something much darker. "You really want to know?" he asked, his voice almost a whisper. For the first time he seemed fully engaged, leaning into the moment as if savoring it. "All right," he finally said. "I'll tell you." A chilling admittance. Over the course of a harrowing hours-long interrogation, Michael Carter began to weave a tale so grotesque and deeply unsettling that even the seasoned detectives listening felt their stomachs churn. His words were calm, clinical, detached, as if he were reciting instructions from a textbook rather than recounting heinous acts of violence. "It wasn't about killing them," he began, his hands resting flat on the table. "It was about saving them." Detective Ramirez raised an eyebrow, her pen poised over her notepad. "Saving them?" she echoed, her voice carefully even. Carter nodded, a dangerous glint in his eyes. "They were lost," he explained. "Women like them, they stray. They think they can live outside the bounds of God's law, outside of submission, outside of his plan. They think they're untouchable. But God, he has a way of humbling the prideful, and I was chosen to be his instrument." He described in shocking detail how he had stalked his victims, watching them for days or even weeks as they went about their lives. "It wasn't random," he confessed. "I needed to see. I needed to understand who they were, what brought them to their arrogance. A woman running alone in the woods, no fear, no guard up. That's defiance. That's pride. And pride, as they say, comes before the fall." Carter's descriptions of the moments leading up to his attacks were unnervingly poetic, almost rehearsed. He explained how he would approach his victims with carefully chosen words, often weaving scripture into his initial interactions. "It wasn't about scaring them," he said. "It was about testing them, giving them one last chance to repent, to turn back to God. Most of them, they failed." He spoke of the murders without any trace of remorse, framing them as acts of righteous discipline. Each detail felt like a knife to the investigator's moral compass. He described the meticulous care he took in leaving a pocket-sized Bible beside every victim, each one marked with a specific verse he felt reflected their sins. Detective Porter, who'd been sitting quietly across the table, couldn't stay silent any longer. "You're telling me," he said, his voice trembling with barely contained anger, "that you actually thought you were doing God's work? That he wanted this?" Carter looked at him with an unsettling calm. "It wasn't about what I thought," he said simply. "It was about what I knew." Revealing the monster detective soon realized that Carter's crimes weren't fueled only by a distorted sense of religious zeal. They were rooted in his need for power and control. Underneath the religious justifications lay a deep well of hatred, particularly toward women. One investigator noted that Carter's confessions frequently drifted into personal diatribes about modern women and their defiance of traditional roles. He couldn't stand the idea of women being free, independent, in control of their own lives, Detective Ramirez explained later. That's what he was punishing them for, and he used religion as a weapon to justify his hatred. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of his confession was how detached he seemed from the humanity of his victims. To Carter, they were symbols, representations of ideas he despised rather than real people with lives, families, and futures. "They were warnings," he said coldly when asked why he chose to arrange the scenes so deliberately. "God doesn't just punish in private, his lessons must be seen." Despite his claims of divine purpose, it became clear to everyone in the room that Carter's motivations were far less lofty. At his core, he was a manipulator, a narcissist driven by the need to assert dominance over others. A final disturbing note. When Carter was asked if he felt regret or shame for what he had done, his response sent a chill through the room. "Regret?" he repeated, almost laughing. "No, I did what needed to be done, what no one else had the courage to do. They called me a monster, but in the end, they'll see. I was right." For the detectives, it was a moment of sobering clarity. This wasn't a man who could be rehabilitated or reasoned with. Michael Carter's worldview was so deeply twisted, his sense of morality so corrupted, that even facing the full weight of the law wouldn't shatter his self-righteous delusion. Carter's confession spanned hours, leaving the room heavy with the grim reality of who he truly was. For Detective Ramirez, the look in his eyes, the complete and utter lack of remorse, was something she would carry with her for the rest of her career. "He wasn't insane," she said in a later interview. "He knew exactly what he was doing and he didn't care. That's what made him terrifying. He wasn't screaming or raving, he was calm, calculated, he was evil, plain and simple. Facing judgment. Michael Carter's confession, gruesome and unapologetic, cemented his fate. It was the final piece prosecutors needed to ensure that justice would be served. But for the families of his victims, his cold, matter-of-fact admissions brought no comfort, only the haunting knowledge that the man who had stolen their loved ones saw his actions not as crimes, but as a perverse duty. In the end, Carter's confession wasn't just an admission of guilt. It was a window into the mind of a predator who had weaponized faith, turning belief into a tool for destruction. And in his own sick, twisted way, he seemed proud of what he'd done. The wake-up call. The story of Michael Carter, the so-called preaching killer, stands as one of the most chilling cautionary tales in modern American history. A dark and painful reminder of how easily evil can disguise itself as virtue. His reign of terror, cloaked behind a mask of divine authority, shattered not only lives but also the collective trust of communities, small towns, and church congregations. It forced society to confront some deeply uncomfortable truths, not just about predators like Carter but about ourselves, our systems, and the blind faith we often place in titles, appearances, and institutions. This wasn't just another serial killer story. Michael Carter didn't hide in the shadows or strike when no one was looking. Instead, he walked straight through the front doors of homes, churches, and lives, wearing a clerical collar and carrying a Bible. He presented himself as one of the good guys, and in doing so, lured countless people into lowering their guards. Carter's crimes were horrific, but they left behind more than grief and shattered lives. They left behind a call to action, a wake-up call about the fragility of trust, the danger of appearances, and the critical need for vigilance, even in the spaces where we feel safest. Blind trust, a double-edged sword. Michael Carter's story raises the question, why do we find it so easy to trust someone based solely on how they appear, or the roles they claim to fill? It's human nature to trust. It's part of what allows communities to function. But Carter weaponized this instinct, using the implicit trust placed in religious figures to manipulate, stalk, and ultimately harm his victims. Many of his victims, according to testimonies from those who knew them, likely never suspected anything when they first encountered him. After all, what harm could come from a clean-cut man quoting scripture and offering a kind word? The very idea that an evil so profound could be wrapped in such a humble and familiar package goes against everything we're taught to believe. But Carter's story teaches us something uncomfortable. That blind trust can be dangerous. Societal norms about respect for authority figures, especially religious ones, can sometimes blind us to obvious red flags. This isn't to suggest that we should live in constant suspicion of everyone, but rather that we should balance trust with discernment. The lesson here isn't that all clergy or authority figures are to be distrusted. The vast majority are genuinely good people working tirelessly to help others. But Carter's manipulation shows why it's vital to listen to your instincts, question inconsistencies, and look past appearance to ensure that trust is earned, not simply given. The vulnerabilities of faith and community. Another painful truth exposed by Carter's crimes is how easily faith, one of humanity's greatest sources of comfort and unity, can be manipulated. Faith communities are built on trust, hospitality, and a belief in redemption. These values are beautiful and vital, but they also create vulnerabilities that predators like Carter exploit. Carter relied on people's desire to see the good in others. Churches welcomed him with open arms because turning someone away felt wrong, unchristian. Congregations didn't want to believe that someone standing in their pulpit reciting verses and calling for prayer could have such dark intentions. One of the most heartbreaking lessons from this case is that even sacred institutions aren't immune to infiltration. Churches, schools, and communities must recognize the need for safeguards, background checks, communication with law enforcement, and open discussions about safety, without compromising their core values. Faith doesn't mean you let your guard down, survivor Sarah Harmon said in a television interview years later. It means you take care of each other, and part of taking care of each other is making sure that wolves don't sneak in dressed as sheep. The importance of listening to instincts. Time and time again we hear stories of people who had a bad feeling about someone, but ignored it because they didn't want to seem rude or paranoid. Michael Carter thrived on this very hesitation. He counted on people suppressing their instincts, reassuring themselves that they were overreacting. Amanda Lowell, the only woman to survive an attack by Carter, spoke openly about the moment she realized something was wrong. "I wanted to ignore it," she admitted. "I kept telling myself, he's a pastor, he's harmless. But then I looked at his eyes and I just knew. Something in me said, run. And thank God I did." Her story serves as a powerful reminder. Your instincts are there for a reason. Ignoring them can have dire consequences. It's better to seem overly cautious and safe than to take chances with your safety. If something or someone feels off, trust yourself and act accordingly. Communities must stay vigilant. Carter's ability to move between towns with ease highlighted glaring gaps in how communities communicate with each other. Churches dismissed him quietly when complaints arose, opting to avoid scandal instead of addressing the problem head-on. Law enforcement agencies in different jurisdictions failed to connect the dots as Carter hopped from one place to the next, leaving a trail of devastation. This tragic mismanagement underscores the need for stronger systems of accountability and communication. Communities must be willing to share information with each other, particularly when it comes to individuals presenting concerning patterns of behavior. Secrecy and avoidance only allow predators like Carter to continue operating unnoticed. Legislation encouraging better cooperation between authorities and religious organizations has been one small step toward addressing this issue, but there's still a long road ahead. This isn't just about preventing future church-related incidents, it's about creating a culture of openness and shared responsibility across all institutions. Protecting what matters without losing ourselves. One of the most difficult questions raised by Carter's crimes is how to protect ourselves without losing the values that define us as communities. How do we maintain kindness, trust, and hospitality while staying vigilant against those who would abuse those very values? This isn't an easy line to walk, but it's a necessary one. Organizations like churches, nonprofit groups, and schools have already begun reassessing their policies to strike a balance between openness and security. Background checks, mandatory reporting of suspected misconduct to law enforcement, and providing safety resources to vulnerable populations like women and children are a few of the steps being taken. On an individual level, this means finding the courage to question the things that don't feel right, to speak up when you see something concerning, even if it feels uncomfortable. Silence and hesitation are what predators like Carter rely on the most. A legacy of lessons for the families of the victims, for the survivors like Amanda Lowell, and for the communities Michael Carter left shattered in his wake. The wounds will never fully heal, but their voices have become the foundation for something greater, a movement to ensure that stories like Carter's never repeat themselves. Evil doesn't always walk in shadows or wear a threatening face. Sometimes it walks into our lives with a smile, a handshake, and words that seem kind but are anything but. This is the hard truth we've learned from Michael Carter, that the capacity for deception knows no bounds, and the only way to combat it is with vigilance and courage. This wasn't just about Michael Carter, Detective Linda Ramirez said in a public statement after the trial. It was about all of us. It's about the steps we take, as a society, to protect what matters while standing up against those who tear it apart. Evil doesn't win. Not when we stand together, stronger and wiser than before. And so, the legacy of the preaching killer became not just one of heartbreak, but also resilience. A grim reminder to watch over the things we hold dear, to trust our instincts, and to never turn a blind eye when something isn't right. For while evil may find ways to slip into our most sacred spaces, it is our collective strength, our vigilance, and our faith in one another that can and will drive it out. The return of peace. Months passed after Patrick Turner's trial and sentencing. For the first time in over a year, Riverside was free of the shadow that had loomed over every quiet street, empty alley, and darkened window. The dime killer was gone, locked away in a maximum security facility where his manipulative mind could no longer pose a threat to the community. But peace, true, lasting peace, was not something that could return overnight. A city changed forever. Riverside, in many ways, did not feel like the city it had once been. Before the killings, it had been a serene, almost idyllic suburban haven. Families hosted neighborhood barbecues, kids played in parks until the streetlights blinked on, and couples took long evening strolls along the riverbank without a second thought. But Turner's reign of terror had stripped away that innocence. One by one, businesses that had suffered from the downturn in late-night customers began reopening to full hours, cautiously testing if people were ready to return to normalcy. Parks started to see more activity again, though parents still watched their children more closely than before, their eyes scanning the horizon for threats that weren't there. And yet, small gestures of hope began flickering back into the city. The way a mother smiled in relief as she unboxed her home's new security system, or the way an elderly man waved to his neighbors again as he watered his yard for the first time in months. It wasn't the peace they had once known, it was cautious, guarded, but it was peace, nonetheless. Rebuilding trust. For Detective Rob Marchant and his team, life after the case wasn't as simple as filing away Patrick Turner's name in the annals of unspeakable horrors. Marchant had become a symbol of resilience for the city, the man who brought down the dime killer. Everyone, from news crews to city officials, wanted to hear his thoughts, his reflections, his retelling of the most harrowing moments of the chase. But Marchant, like many others, didn't feel ready to move on. Not completely. One cloudy afternoon, Marchant found himself sitting in his precinct office, staring at the crude crime board that had remained untouched since the night Turner was arrested. Red string still connected victims' photos to locations, boot prints, and surveillance images of motorcycles. In the center was a photo of Turner himself, now scarred with a big black X. Charlene Pruitt walked in, gently knocking on the open door. "You know, you could take it down." "Clean slate, Rob," she said softly, her coffee steaming in her hands. Marchant leaned back in his squeaky office chair, letting out a dry chuckle. "Clean slate, huh?" He motioned toward the wall of evidence with a nod. "I take this down, and it feels like giving him one last victory. Like I'm saying, we're finally done." There was hesitation in his voice. "But for some reason, I don't feel done." Pruitt set her coffee down and sat in the chair across from his desk, crossing her legs. "You know what I've been thinking about?" she began. "Emily Reed, the way she fought back, the way she stood up there in court with her whole life still ahead of her." Marchant met her gaze, his brow furrowing slightly. "She, and everyone else, survived because we did the job, Rob. It doesn't feel done to you because we've spent so much time in this darkness," Pruitt continued, "but it's over, finally. And it's more than okay to let it be over." The silent scars of grief. For many families, though, the healing process wasn't linear. The loved ones of Turner's victims faced a bittersweet kind of peace. They no longer needed to fear nameless evil lurking in the streets, but the person responsible for their loss still lived, occupying a small space in the public's consciousness and a large one in theirs. Neighborhood vigils continued for months after Turner's sentencing. Every few weeks a new candlelit gathering would take place at a different location in the city, a park bench, a school playground, a coffee shop patio, all spots tied to one of his victims. "The hardest part," one grieving parent said during a local TV interview, "is telling yourself that life has to go on, that the grocery stores don't stop stocking shelves, that the sun still rises and sets, whether you want it to or not. That's what peace feels like now, a reminder of what's gone but also the faintest glimmer of what still is." Their words hung in the hearts of the city residents. Life moving forward, but accompanied by the weight of what had been left behind. The people who stayed and stood together. Among the city's heroes, those who became symbols of defiance against Turner's terror, Emily Reed, the lone survivor, stood tallest. Though she'd been reserved and quiet before her attack, Emily began reaching out to the families of the other victims after the trial ended. She attended every memorial vigil, lent her voice to a city council meeting on improving public safety, and even volunteered as an advocate for trauma survivors. "I didn't survive for nothing," Emily told a local reporter in a rare interview months after the trial. "There's strength in this city, more strength than one man's evil could ever overpower. He thought he could break us. He was wrong." Emily's words weren't just hope for herself, but an anthem for Riverside's new identity. It was no longer just a sleepy suburban city. Now it was a city that had endured the worst kind of nightmare and lived to tell the story. A neighborhood restored slowly but surely, Riverside began piecing itself back together. Parents once again felt comfortable letting their children ride bicycles freely down suburban streets. Hardware stores reported dwindling sales on padlocks as newly installed fences and security systems became less urgent priorities. By summer, the city's parks bustled with the laughter of children playing beneath smiling parents' watchful eyes. A sense of normalcy returned, even if the memories of the past year lingered in the back of the collective consciousness. Folks in line at the grocery store didn't flinch as much when they heard the distant hum of a passing motorcycle. Neighbors began trusting one another again, waving over fences and trading recipes at block parties, simple acts that once seemed trivial but now felt triumphant. A quiet reflection. One late evening, months after the trial, Marchant strolled along the riverbank where Riverside got its name. The water shimmered under the moonlight, its gentle current carrying with it the memory of quieter times. He carried a dime in his hand, not one from Turner's crime scenes but one he'd found on the courthouse steps the day Turner was sentenced. Holding it up in the moonlight, Marchant let out a long sigh. The dime felt lighter now. It meant less, but it also meant everything. As he dropped the coin into the flowing water, watching it sink out of sight, he finally let go, of the case, of the sleepless nights, of the endless questions that had haunted him. Riverside was finally healing, and so was he. Riverside, though scarred and changed, was rediscovering what it meant to live in peace. This expanded section paints a vivid emotional picture of a city recovering from trauma, balancing hope with the lingering scars of its pain. It introduces threads of resilience through Emily and Marchant, while spotlighting the small, subtle ways people rebuild after enduring the unthinkable. Let me know if you'd like me to emphasize anything further.